Here we go. We're recording.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar for 811. Renato Almanzor is our presenter. Pam would be on duty, but she has lost her voice, and so I agreed to come along and work with Matt, who is facilitating, to be a bit of a voice should it be needed. Renato and I worked together at the Bay Area Coalition for Equitable Schools. Back in the early 2000s, we were both school change coaches and worked for a nonprofit primarily in Oakland Unified Schools, and I also did some work in San Francisco, and I think Renato was in some other school districts. He can name those in a moment. My best and first early memory of working with Renato was the fact that we were both parents of students who were enrolled in Oakland Unified. And so we had the perspective of parents as well as nonprofit coaches. And I think that was just very reassuring for me because the majority of our staff didn't have kids at all, much less in the districts where we were doing our work. So it was really terrific to have that opportunity. He's been a wonderful mentor to me and someone who really understands organizational theory deeply. You can thank Renato for the Shine Reader, so I want to put that out there before we get too far into the program tonight. Pam is having them, Renato, plow through a few articles at a time to Shine Reader. So I wanted to share that as we get started. Welcome so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I actually wasn't thinking about our time together so much then as much as just even our time at Cal State East Bay and thinking through that. But that's right. We did a lot of stuff and a lot of work back in the day with the Bay Area Coalition for Equitable Schools. And so what my understanding is, based on just the thoughtfulness of questions and pieces that many of you have had a chance to kind of go through the webinar that I shared a little bit. I did sometime last year, as well as a talk that I did on transforming power and privilege, and then later changed it to transforming power and love. And I'm hoping, to some extent, that I decided to go ahead and attempt to address those questions. At one point, I was thinking I was going to, create something magical that had a presentation that hit up all those questions in a nice, coherent way. And then I thought I'd just go through it. So, and some of that was due to time, and some of that was just due to my inability to kind of see the connections right off the bat. But now, as I prepared these slides, it's like, oh, I know how I could have done it. But the other thing I want to share with you is that in addition to doing some work, I think some of you have my bio as well. One of the things that you should know that's happening for me right now is I'm running for school board in Oakland Unified School District. So one of the things that's interesting about that is the folks that I'm running in aren't really parents, similar to what Michelle said. It's like they're in education, or one is in education. He's been a teacher before, but now he's an attorney. So it's interesting to kind of hear the level of discourse that occurs when folks find out that not only was I a parent, but I was also involved in education to some extent. So that's that. The other thing I want to share with you is that I'm going to go through this process because of my earlier conversations with Pam and Michelle, recognizing that I think you all are at a certain place in your program where you all have tried stuff out. And I think one of the key things that I've gotten from Shine, as well as other folks like Arduous and Senge, is the idea of what are our theories of action when we go into work, and then what were our actual theories in use. And so I'm going to talk through some stuff, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do some of these things, because I actually do want you to leave with some handout completed as an activity, but I haven't really done it this way before. But let me also say too that I'm not really going to track the questions if you're sending them via chat. I'm going to trust that Matt or Michelle will go ahead and interrupt me if needed, because as good a multitasker as I think I am, I also can get totally distracted by myself, so let alone by reading all your comments and questions at the same time. So just know that Matt, Michelle, feel free to kind of either read out the chat questions as I'm going along, or just turn people's voices on, and I'm fine with that.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So let me say, and you've heard this probably as well, that I like to start that my full name is Dr. Renato Patrick Insiong Inabangan Almanzor Jr. And throughout our conversation, it's fine if you call me Renato. And I share that with you really because I do bring all of who I am with me, just as it's my assumption that you bring all of who you are with you. And so when we're talking about diagnosing organizational dynamics, it really requires that we expect that folks are bringing all of who they are into the spaces in which we work. And especially in educational settings, that we want our kids to feel like they can be all of who they are, even while we're trying to support their achieving the promise and potential that I think the educational experience should be giving. So with that, I've kind of formulated some of the thoughts that I've had from your questions and from the earlier conversations with Michelle and Pam to say, really what I want to talk about is this idea of leadership for movement building. I know there are a lot of questions about what power and love is and what are social change happen. I'm going to get into that. But for me, in this time in my life, I'm really recognizing that if we're really just looking at leadership for the purposes of something singular or isolated, like leadership in education or leadership in healthcare or leadership in housing or immigration, then we're really missing what leadership really is. And so for me, what leadership really is, and you may have heard this from Michelle and others, I learned pretty early on that leadership is really taking responsibility for what matters. So it requires that I know what matters. It requires that not what it matters to others, but also what matters for me specifically. And so even as you're listening to me today, I hope that you're listening to me with a critical lens, a critical thinking lens especially. And I know you all have kind of played around with Frere, and so for me, this is about how do we have that critical consciousness in the mix. And I've shared often that critical thinking for me are three things, right? It's doing craft detecting, it's pursuing relevance, and asking the question, what's worth knowing? So when we do craft detecting, even as you're listening to me, I recognize that we've been told what we should read, what we should believe, what we should feel, how we should dress, how we should talk. So we've been should on all our lives. So how do we really know what's important when there's all this should that's been placed upon us? And I know should happens, right? So how do we figure out how to move from that to identify truly what matters and who I really am? And that's some of the process. I need to ask the question, how am I going to do that? How am I going to determine what is the stuff that's crap? But not only that, what's really relevant? To be a critical thinker or be in critical dialogue means I actually have to actively pursue being relevant, pursue what's relevant to me, what's meaningful. So it's not enough to listen to this webinar or be in this dialogue with me right now and say, bring it on, let me see what's right or wrong. I hope you're actually actively pursuing what might be relevant to your context, to your life, to your work, to your family, to your community, as well as saying, dude, that's crap, right? So, for example, we've been taught early on that Columbus discovered America. How can you discover a place where people are already kicking it, right? Crap. So when we move from what and how, we're talking about doing some craft detecting, pursuing relevance, and the third thing to critical thinking is asking the question, what's worth knowing? And for me, what's worth knowing around leadership is asking, why does this matter to me? Why does it matter to you? Why does it matter to us, and why might it not matter? Because if I'm truly doing critical thinking, I might acknowledge what things I might consider crap, but someone else thinks is very relevant. Or I might be acting on something that's relevant, and someone else thinks it's not so important. And that's good information. That's good data. And so in this talk, I'm going to push us to I'm going to share a little bit of my favorite leadership theories for a moment. Set it within the context of how I've defined competence. Some of you had questions about competence in the questions, and then hopefully bring it back down to what, how, and why for you. Let me say the thing that I'm going to have you do, one of the handouts I included in the packet was an activity to create a personal mission statement. And I think that's going to be really important as you continue on to be the social change activist I hope you're becoming. So I flashed a slide up a number of times, and a lot of this I did get from my work with Michelle at the Bay Area Coalition for Equitable Schools. And I also connected it to Porras, Emery, and Thompson's book, Success Built to Last, where I define having competence as having the knowledge, skills, capacity, and will to do whatever. So leadership competence means having knowledge about leadership, theories, frameworks, and processes. Means skills around leadership, having intellectual rigor, behavioral discipline, emotional intelligence, having the capacity for leadership, and that means readiness, things like confidence, having the time to be a good leader, and the resources around you. But the other thing that I think folks often leave out is the will to be competent. You know, why are you doing what you're doing? What are your purposes? What are your principles? Are you truly curious and honoring not just yourself but other people in the mix? And so for me, to truly be competent means to align these things as much as possible. So in the middle diagram, the thought relates to knowledge, the action relates to skills, the meaning relates to will, and the blue circle around it is capacity. A lot of my work at this organization called LeaderSpring is actually developing the competence of leaders who are nonprofit executive directors as well as community leaders so that they can enhance their organizational effectiveness to get to greater community impact. Actually, let me just pause for a second and let me just see. I get excited and I know I talk quickly. So if folks can kind of just, I don't know, give a thumbs up if I'm going too quickly or you want me to slow down. How do I do that? What do you think, Matt?
Well, I haven't seen any questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
no questions are coming in, but I think...
I'm tracking you, okay.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any thoughts? Is it any faster, slower? No, I guess we're good. No one's...
Good. And I'm sitting down, so if I was standing up, I'd be talking 10 times faster. So just as a heads up. So if you want me to kneel down, that might slow me down if I need to, but I definitely
here they're
won't.
coming in now. Can you repeat? So we have one from Ryan. Can you repeat the literature this framework is from? Shine. And
yeah, this framework, competence framework, is adapted from the work of Porras, Emery, and Thompson down at the bottom from the book called Success Built to Last.
Right, I can see it now, Ryan, at the very bottom of this.
Yes, at the very bottom. And what they did was interviewed tons of, do I need to do something with my thing? Yeah, what they did was interview all kinds of leaders, got a lot of narratives and stories. And it's a great book just to kind of hear stories. And they spend a lot of time on each of these pieces, the pieces being the thought, action, and meaning pieces. And the importance of alignment.
Good reference. We'll pick it up and add it to our course as well. So they'll have that going forward.
And they're business people, right? So they've written a whole bunch of other. And Porras has also kind of worked with other folks around Built to Last and a study of organizations that were so big that they seem like they're going to last forever. And, of course, 10 years after the book, you know, a lot of them crashed. And so it's really interesting to see his reflections of what happened with those organizations. So I'm going to go forward in that just sharing with you that some of my favorite theories are these, right? So what I'm learning about leadership and working with some of the most phenomenal leaders with whom I've ever interacted, I feel so fortunate to be able to be in a space where I'm inspired by the inquiry stance that leaders take, working with some of the most in-need communities. So I run a fellowship program for nonprofit executive directors, and we purposely recruit folks into the fellowship who are working with low-income or communities of color in the Bay Area, so San Francisco and the East Bay, which includes Oakland and Richmond and Berkeley. And a lot of these leaders are can range from being leaders who are, we have one who's been an executive director for 32 years and another one who's been in for 18 months. We have some organizations as small as having a budget of $300,000 and another organization that's as big as $75 million. And so I get to work with all these leaders who are doing pretty phenomenal things in lots of different areas like housing or immigration or homelessness, as well as education and health. And one of the things that I've gotten to is recognizing that we have to move really from just having individual leadership models and really thinking of what organizational leadership looks like. And I draw a lot of my organizational metaphors now from a book called Communities by Peter Block, The Structure of Belonging. And essentially what he says in there is that there is a challenge to moving from just this individual leadership piece. And what we really have to do is understand that as leaders or folks in communities, our work is to create a community that has a structure of belonging where folks feel like they belong, but the second connotation is that they also feel like the community belongs to them. So not only do they feel like they belong, that they, yes, I should be here, but that the direction as it's going and growing, that I actually have an obligation to contribute who I am and what I am. Some of the other leadership ideas that and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because I want to be able to have some, go in depth with some of the other questions that you all raised. Yeah, are things, and I already shared, leadership is taking responsibility for what matters, and that comes from Julian Weisglass. First, I don't know, I'm sure other people said it, and I think there's a school somewhere in the southeast that takes that on as one of their mottos. Managers do things right, leaders do the right things, and that's Warren Bennis. And then Leading with Soul is one of my favorite books in that it's a story rather than just a business book. But Bowman and Deal do write business books and organizational cultures. I think they wrote a book on organizational framework and diagnosis that you all may have peeked at. But what they say leadership is giving and receiving these four things: authorship, power, love, and significance. The idea that we need to be the authorities of our own lives, but we also have to respect how other people have authored their life. And if we respect that, when we're working together, we become the authority of our lives jointly. And I talked a lot about power and love, and they mentioned that, again, being able to give and receive power and love. And that last one, significance, is the idea that, it has dual connotations in leadership, in that it means acknowledging that what someone has, what you're giving to another and receiving from another, is meaningfulness. How are we giving and receiving meaning from each other? That's significance. The other part of it is not only does it have meaning, but it becomes important. The other ones, again, folks that are pretty popular, Cruises and Posner. A lot of folks have seen the Leadership Challenge, and there's a lot of critiques about their work, but what I appreciated is that it's pretty simple. So there's like 5 headings and then 10 other pieces underneath it, so it kind of gives some explanation. But the other thing that I appreciate is that it also talks a lot about understanding processes. And while it still feels singular in the title and in the presentation, if we really look at it, it really is about developing other people's leadership. And Goldman wrote a short article that talked about 6 leadership styles. One of my hopes at some point is to kind of take those 6 and just create some sort of assessment to really land people really clearly. And what Goldman suggests is that not any one is better than the other, even though some people do believe some are better than the other. And I actually feel like some are. What he also talks about is that some are situational, right? And so that's the situational leadership literature that's out there as well, and that's part of what he describes. This other one is from Jim Collins, Good to Great. There's a monograph that he wrote for the social sector as well. And what I appreciate about this is, and Ralph Nader's quote wasn't in the book, but I think it pertains to this, is that if we think about leadership, it's really about developing other leaders, not finding more followers, right? And so when you think of the leader, level 5 leader and the management team, he suggests that when you're creating leadership, the level 5 leader is the one who's passionate and humble. Passionate and humble enough to know that what they want to do is figure out how to get other passionate and humble people into their area, and that's how you build a superior team, and then you figure out what's right for us, as opposed to the level 4 leader, which suggests a little less great, if you will, but a good leader is the leader who is the genius who wants to find a whole bunch of helpers around them. So they'll say, this is my strength, so around me I need a budget. I'm good at communicating. So what I need is a budget person. What I need is a development person. What I need is a strategy person to complement me. So they say, first what? What do I have and what do I need, and then I fill it that way. And so both exist, and I'm sure we have a lot of examples in that, but in Jim Collins' book, he suggests that level 5 leadership is what makes organizations great, where level 4 leadership is what keeps organizations good but never be great. The other article and writing that I appreciate is John Cotter, where he wrote an article called "What Leaders Really Do." And so the bottom two boxes are headings. He says that leadership complements management; it doesn't replace it. So a lot of my work, even when I call my work leadership development, I am instilling competencies around management, right? So it's not enough for me to work with folks who say they want to be leaders and help them be competent in setting direction and aligning resources and motivating people. I believe excellent leadership requires good management. So I do work with folks to learn how to do good plans and budgets, how to create good organizations and staffing around it, and how to be prepared for controlling complexity and problem solving. Again, Cotter says leadership complements management and doesn't replace it. And when we're talking about creating a leader-full organization, we need to think about how are we supporting folks to develop both the leadership and management competencies. In this particular slide, I share this with the executive directors with whom I work. And what I offer to them is that if you look at what they're responsible for, they are responsible for governance, leadership, and management. The board is really mostly responsible for governance and leadership, and the staff is responsible for leadership and management. So that's just a way to kind of reflect where folks are focusing their energies. Sometimes I have to work with executive directors to support the board that they need to know that they're not a part of management. The board might manage themselves, but sometimes boards become ineffective when they start getting too low into what the staff should be doing. Yeah, and then the other thing, another way that I like to think of the distinction between management and leadership is that I believe oftentimes what we get from managers is the how question. How do you do it? How long will it take? How much does it cost? How do you get those people to change? How do we measure it? And how are other people doing things successfully? Oops, typo there, sorry. And those aren't bad questions. But again, those are often questions that managers will ask, where I think leaders are really asking questions about what really matters for our organization. So questions like, what refusal have I been postponing? And what that refers to is being able to say, sometimes I do need to say no. As a leader, I need to be able to say, we are prioritizing this because we can't prioritize everything. Instead of asking, how long will it take, the leader is asking, or the leadership question is, what commitment am I willing to make? Instead of asking the question, just how much does it cost, the leadership question is, what is the price I am willing to pay? So it understands that sometimes there's a degree of just rolling up the sleeve and putting some skin in the game. What is my contribution to the problem I'm concerned with? What is the crossroad at which I find myself at this point in my life in our work? And what do we want to create together instead of just asking how have other people done it? And this is from another book by Peter Block called The Answer to How is Yes. And what I really appreciate about this book, and he doesn't frame it in terms of management and leadership, and that's just how I've kind of taken the frame. But what I appreciate about this is it really gets to saying what are our values around being leaders. And sometimes we can't just ask how all the time if we're not really getting to what truly matters. Let me pause there and just see if there are any questions about what folks have. I want to go I have another 5 minutes worth of kind of material, and then I want to try to get people into creating a personal mission statement and then share how that all works together. So any questions or comments that folks want to jump out, point out?
Nothing coming in at the moment.
All right. Okay, so here's the other thing that I want to just acknowledge and recognize. And this is something that it's going to feel ancillary, but I want to say for our work and my work, it's at the core, right? And that is we need, so a lot of my work, and if you, again, hopefully you got from some of the other talks I've given, and I think I may have touched upon this in one of them, that it's my belief that we are operating in a context of oppression. And what that means is, as social change activists, and one group asked this question, a question about this quote, that as social change activists, we need to acknowledge that we are a part of, not apart from, the woundedness of our world. And what I mean by that, right, is that as a man, I haven't escaped sexism. Just like as a person of color, I haven't escaped racism. As a person who was raised poor and working class, I haven't escaped classism. And I think the work, so even as a man who hasn't escaped sexism, so I might be affected by sexism just as a woman has been affected by sexism. And it just looks differently, right? There's something different about how that interaction happens. And I think part of the work for me and for what I do with others is to be able to recognize when this, not just behavioral manifestations of oppression occur, but what are the systems that collude or conditions for fostering some of these behavioral manifestations of oppression. And so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but let me point you in the direction of the organization Visions Incorporated, who've written quite a bit about this. And I'm sorry I don't have the article. I didn't make that available, but if you prompt me, Michelle or Matt, I can go ahead and get that to you. But their stuff is pretty easy to find, Visions Incorporated. But the idea, and I like to use this when I'm working with executive directors, and so some of you might already be in leadership positions and might already be supervising folks. So let me kind of put this in the context of, say, supervision, for example. So for myself, I like to look at it as a supervisor being on the left and the supervisee being on the right. And not that it inherently is oppressive, because I think there are good relationships where people have different power and authority dynamics, but we need to be able to see how sometimes we unintentionally manifest behavioral behaviors that are oppressive. So for example, one of the things that happens for me as a supervisor that this is what oppression looks like is when I do this thing called dysfunctional rescuing, right? So I might delegate something to a staff member that I know they can do. But they might take longer to do it, or they might be struggling a little bit to do it, and for whatever reason, it's not just happening, and I'll take it back, and I'll just do their job for them. And that, to me, is an example of dysfunctional rescuing. Let me put it now in a racial context. Sometimes that happens when whites recognize that some people of color are having to do stuff, and rather than recognize that struggling sometimes is a part of getting something done, they might just take the work back and do it for them. And it feels like a nice thing to do. Let me just do it for you. But what I'm offering is that this is oppression when you're kind of rescuing them from actually taking responsibility for what's actually theirs. And on the flip side of that, what starts to happen with a staff member is that they start to do some system beating. They might recognize that, if I just struggle a little bit, if I take a little bit longer, my boss will take it back. So I know I don't really have to worry about this. Even though I know it's my job, they're just going to go ahead and take it back, and that's my way of beating the system. The other way it might play out is I might start saying, man, they're just weak there. There's just something that's not strong about them. So I start blaming the victim for something that I may have created because I keep taking work back from them and don't really support them in getting it done. And then what happens, I'll write this up in a performance appraisal, and that person will say, well, it's an unfair evaluation because you kept taking the work back from me, and it's a problem with our evaluation system. And then it can get even worse. It starts spiraling even more where I start avoiding contact with that person. I don't even delegate anymore because I just have all these thoughts about their inability to be successful. I might start tacking on the word laziness to them or incompetent, and that person might realize that, gosh, they're just giving me all the bad stuff. They don't give me any of the good work, and that creates in some antagonistic avoidance of contact. And then it spirals even more where I don't recognize the differences between us, that I actually have power and authority in this particular situation. And And then the other person starts to think about, gosh, I'm denying my own cultural differences and heritage, right? Now I wonder if it's a Latino thing, or if it's a white thing, or all these other things, or it's just me, that there's no contextual thing to that. And then it spirals even more. And so let me just say that I went through that quickly, but part of the work for me is to be able to work with leaders to be able to say, at what point are we doing things that look like the stuff on the left? And can we recognize some of those behaviors of staff that are working for us who might have less power than us, those things on the right? Similarly, given our various racial, cultural, gender, sexual orientation dynamics, to what extent am I on the right side? As a person of color, as working class, as someone with a disability, any of these things, then I might start internalizing the stuff on the right, and I see some of the expressions of people who are interacting with me who have more power look like the behaviors on the left. So part of the work here, just recognizing these behaviors. And let me say then, I'm not just going to leave you with saying what those behaviors look like, but instead I'm going to say, and there are alternative behaviors when we are struggling. So instead of dysfunctional rescuing, I know I need to do some helping. And helping looks different, where for me, Rary said that oftentimes we can recognize oppression in systems because people in power are doing things for the people rather than with the people. And anytime you're doing work for, oftentimes it's a matter of trust. I don't trust you to do things with me. And he says that trust is that indispensable precondition to revolutionary change. So whatever I'm doing, if I feel like I'm doing something for people, I'm always checking, is this my responsibility, is this my job, or am I doing something that's more dysfunctional? And can I really do it with this person? Can I be more of a helper rather than do things for people? So that's a tip in terms of what I'm looking for. And again, I'll make these slides available so you have all these. But these are just another way to think about how we can be in working with each other, acknowledging that there's always going to be some power differentials. And I'm not going deeply into the distinction between power and authority, but recognizing that power is that ability to fulfill or obstruct achieving our goals or achieving satisfying our needs, right? Where authority is something that's inherent within a systemic positionality, right? So let me pause there and just see again if there are any questions, because I know I went through that pretty quickly.
Renato, Laura's got a question, and it's more complex than she can put in a few words. I'm going to open her mic and let her
awesome.
talk to you. Laura, how are you doing tonight? Laura, your mic's open. So let me say what her question is, and then maybe she can chime in. Her question was, what do you do when you have a great leader but are being forced into managing? So I think her leader...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, so go ahead. It's a great question, but I think I won't get it enough context without you jumping in. Go ahead.
So it refers back to the slide talking about managers asking how questions, leaders ask what matter questions.
Yeah.
So my question is, when you have a leader that asks the what matters question, but higher ups kind of force you back into the managing.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? That just happened to me yesterday.
Yeah, and and a lot of what I get from working with, especially the mid managers, the mid-level execs, it's a matter of. I was just working with someone on Sunday who said, that they struggle with me for asking why all the time. They just want me to say that I'm doing it, right? And that to me just raises the flag that, well, this is my take, and then we can build on that. I think one of the things that raises for me is that folks aren't comfortable in their leadership positions, right? If you're unable to kind of hear what matters questions from those that report to you or supervise you, then you yourself have probably been promoted because of your good management and not necessarily your good leadership. And I think that's where at some point the conversation has to get pushed to being able to have both of these questions. So being able to offer, though, first, how answers, and then checking it with the why. So that's one. and I don't know if that makes sense, but another way to think about how it makes sense is checking the relationship between the theory of action and the theory in use. So for example, some people want to say, hey, just do it. And so oftentimes what I find exciting, and this is me though, I'm not everybody, from the mid-level execs when I was there, or as I'm there, is being able to say, if we do this, then we do that, and so we get there, right? That makes sense, but why can't we go doing this to lead to that, to do that? So it's that whole logic model as well as theory of action kind of discourse that helps people move from just the how to what matters. And you don't have to say, well, this is my theory of action, right? But in some ways what you're doing is having theory of action questions, but also backing up with, because this is what I'm inferring from our theory in use. Or this is what I'm inferring from what our behaviors are, because when we do this, this leads to that, and this is what seems important. But I want to raise that this is really even seems more important, and this is the price that I think we can play. You want to respond to that, or Laura? Or?
I don't know if I have a response. I mean,
Okay.
I'm stuck. My supervisor was a what matters kind of leader, and he wasn't doing enough of the how, so now he's no longer our supervisor. So
Yeah,
we're stuck with managing now,
yeah,
instead of doing, what matters.
yeah. And I think that's the difficult thing. Again, part of what I feel and believe is that leadership complements management. It doesn't replace it, right? So somehow the more effective leader has to be able to demonstrate the ability to ask the what matters and the how questions and give good answers to both. And because the leadership or management around them may only be able to do one or the other, and that's where you kind of need to do a study of the culture of the executives, and figure out what's really happening. And most organizations, I think, tend to have one kind of leader person and everyone else being manager, practicing management. And I think that's unfortunate because, again, really I think that the key to more effective and equitable organizations in particular are folks who are, to have leaderful organizations, folks who can ask what matter questions and how questions, and then be able to provide responses to both.
Right. Thank you.
So that's it for now. You can just forge ahead there, Renato.
All right, so let me say that this is my belief, right? I think part of your work, and again, I don't think we're going to be able to get through this all, but my belief in your work is to kind of know your own what, how, and why, right? So in the organization where I work, this is our mission, that we foster a powerful and equity-driven social sector by strengthening leaders and organizations, developing communities of leaders, and transforming the systems in which they work. And so we know what vision, mission, and values statements are. Vision is that image of a mission being accomplished, the ideal future state. A task, purpose, and or calling is what the mission is. And then the values are the beliefs or judgment about what is worthy, what's important or desirable. So in your handout, I'm just going to talk you through this because we're not going to have time to do it. But let me just say, in your packet, there's something that says personal mission statement, right? And what I would have done is to kind of lead you through and I encourage you to do this, right? To lead you through that first list of verbs. It starts with accomplish, and then reading across, it's acquire and adopt, is be able to just circle 20 that you're really good at. And then from that 20, circle 10 that you're really great at. And then from that 10, identify 5 that you're super duper awesome at, right? And those are verbs that so that's really, what are your good hows, right? So what are things that you're really, again, super duper awesome at? And you know that because someone might have told you, you're really super duper awesome at that. And then if you go from there, being able to go to the next page and ask the questions or answer the questions, what do you really stand for? What are your principles and values or purposes that you believe you devote your life and work to? What is at the core of your practice? Why do you do what you do? And then be able to turn that into some phrase or that reflects reflects the things you wrote above. So really spending some time writing that. And then going to the third page that says, what do you want to serve, be around, learn from, and impact in a positive way? And so for me, what I did was create, from the first page, I turned those 5 verbs into 3. And the second page, I said, this is really what my purpose and values are. And my third page, oh, another typo, is where I took from the third page, the mission piece number 3. So my mission is to facilitate, integrate, and understand a love-based social justice agenda for community development. So when I think about this, facilitating, that's what I do. I'm good at really working with diverse groups, being able to kind of get to deep meaning, being able to make some things make sense, being able to develop relationships, developing shared visions, developing shared purposes, and being able to integrate all the different ways that we can do things. And not integrate in a way that makes it like mush, but really integrate and see what's our systemic view of things. How is it related to something else? And then understand. I'm big on studying. I love to read. I love to look at data. I love to kind of make meaning and stuff, but all towards a love-based social justice agenda. And I think I may have shared in one of the pieces, I used to work at UC Berkeley as Associate Dean of Students. And while I was there, I was in charge of protest management, right? So a lot of my work was being able to, hey, whenever there's a protest, I'd go up there and try to figure out what's happening and really support them and support the staff or prepare folks if a building was going to be taken over or if there was a march that was going to happen. And sometimes I was there at a time where there was not only protests, but there were counter-protests. And so while I was there, I rewrote the policy from calling it protest management to activism support, because it was my belief that our role as a university wasn't to try to squelch or manage protests. It's really to help support folks to align their behaviors to their beliefs. So if people believed that the way to interrupt inequity was to take over a building, more power to them. I also wanted to let them know that the impact might include some of them being arrested. And if some of them were undocumented, you might want to say, just to let you know, if you're undocumented or you don't have papers, you might get arrested and you might get deported and those kinds of things. When I heard there was a protest happening or a counter-protest happening, sometimes I would try to get the leaders together actually to meet beforehand and say, hey, what are you trying to do at these things? Is there something that you can expect of each other? And so it was a tricky thing. Sometimes they wouldn't meet, but oftentimes they would be able to say, this is what we want to say and do, and this is what we expect of you. And people would make agreements about where they would stand, even as they were yelling at each other. And for me, it was all about community development. And I'm a member of many different communities, so not just Oakland, but I'm talking about a community of Filipinos, a community of men, community of single parents, community of firstborns, and all these kinds of things. So I think the work, and what you'll see in the packet as well, are just a worksheet that I actually do every week where I kind of reflect on my life, like how well did I live my mission this last week, and what's my intention for living out my mission next week. And so what I got from my earlier conversation with Pam and Michelle was the idea that you all are, in a lot of ways, emerging social change activists. And what does it really take is to kind of know yourself as well as possible, because people are going to push on that hard. And I think to be able to have something like a mission statement that you're willing to just profess or kind of live by is something that's pretty cool. Any questions or comments about how you do that or what that activity is about?
Yeah, Renato, we have a housekeeping question here, and that is, I think you've sent your materials on to Pam. Pam, do you have enough voice to answer that question? I opened your mic.
The materials,
right.
the materials from in the email, you mean?
From
yeah,
Renato,
from the email I sent this morning to Matt.
Yes, yes. I've got them on my computer.
Okay, so we'll, Ann and some other people had the question. So we will arrange to have Renato's handouts posted in the, what, Module 8, Pam?
Well, I was thinking wherever we post his,
maybe in the parking lot.
Well, wherever we post the video, I was thinking we'd put them there.
Yeah, I'll stick them right when I upload the video tonight.
I thought they were safe. Okay.
When I put up the video tonight, I'll load the documents in with it.
All right. Well, Ann will have them up by tomorrow. Poor Pam. I'm going to close your mic.
No. You're making me
Okay,
cry.
Renato, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, again, the other reason why I think this is important to kind of know where people stand is that's one, just kind of know where we are. But I think the other question that we really need to ask ourselves is, how do we think social change happens? Where should we focus? And I love this quote from Audre Lorde, and I love a lot of quotes from a lot of stuff that she wrote, but I came upon this one recently, where she says, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. And so as I've dived into this education world, what I'm recognizing even more so is that educational justice isn't just about education. And I'm going to need to jump ahead 2 slides to kind of say what I think it is. And for me, and I'll talk about what I think social change, how social change happens, and then what I want to do after that is I probably share a little bit about the consulting practice, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I think the storyline for education is really more than just saying education. The important aspect of educational justice is that it's again more than getting better educational outcomes. It doesn't only mean improving our schools, but it also means moving policies, practices, and power dynamics to improve environmental, health, social, and economic outcomes. And a lot of these upstream social determinants of education, like income, health, and neighborhood conditions, are often at the root of poor education and educational disparity. So a lot of what I'm talking about, even in my campaign and even in the community with which I interact, is saying we can't just look at schools, but we have to say, what is the safety thing that's happening, right? We know that it's hard to be a good father when they're not working. So we can't just blame them for some of these things. We have to go a little bit beyond that. The second thing is that it's more, again, educational justice is more than just about focusing on schools. It's not just about school outcome, like improved teaching and learning, while it's important, but it's also a strategy, building the capacity of an engaged citizenry of teachers, students, and families toward continued social change. In other words, for me, changes can start in our school, but they don't end there. So it's not just about changing the outcomes, it's about changing the way we interact with each other. And even now, I think about educational justice isn't just about things like policy. In California, we have taken on the Common Core, stuff that I know is hitting a number of states. But the other thing that just happened in California, and I don't know if you all have heard about this, is the governor signed some work to do this thing called local control funding formula. Have you all heard about this?
Have not.
Okay. So essentially what it is, it's pushing greater accountability at the local level with some caveats that districts are creating budgets that have an equity focus. And what they're saying is, for sure, you must prioritize. We're going to give you more money to prioritize low-income students, foster kids, and English learners. And if you have some other data that demonstrates that other kids need this additional money, then you need to make the case. But you're making the case to the community, and the community has to work with the board to sign off on this accountability plan. So, for example, in Oakland, we've gotten on board or even been a leader in a lot of the national work on boys and men of color. Right? So we have an office that's called African American Male Achievement in Oakland Unified, where we're doing a lot of work recognizing that our black and brown boys are graduating at 50%. Right? Where overall we're 62%, and our Latina or Asian and white are like 80%. Right, graduation rate. So being able to say we need to focus on those areas that are at most need. The other area that they want to add additional money to is special ed. So in Oakland, because of the way they've kind of laid it out, we've been told we are looking at the data and looking at the classifications, we're going to get an additional $28 million to kind of work with those populations, but the sign-off of how that's going to happen has to be jointly done, or it's going to be done by the board, but there has to be a demonstration of how the district is holding themselves accountable, and that plan, the accountability plan, will be approved by the county. So they need to be able to see that there has to be a demonstration that the community was engaged, and so that's parents as well as students. And I can tell you right now, in Oakland, they've done a poor job of including students, but I think they've done a pretty good job of engaging communities, because Michelle can tell you we have a number of different organizing groups that are good at getting parents and community members showing up to board meetings, showing up to study groups, to be able to understand budgets, to be able to understand policy, to be able to understand common core, and be able to have those questions and engage really good dialogue with the leaders of the school district. So again, to do educational justice means to be able to recognize that it's more than just education. It's not a single issue. Are there a lot of questions from this? I'm guessing there would be.
No, I don't think so. I think people are appreciating your presentation, so I think you can carry on.
Okay. So let me go back to then this other slide. Again, putting it in context. For me, when I think of social change, I need to understand change. And again, I'm drawing from Senge, where he says, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And so the practice for us who are who are social change leaders means to recognize when people feel coerced, that's a flag. Because I don't think, again, drawing from Freire and understanding the popular education or populist education, right, that it's more than just doing work for, it's doing work with. And so whenever people feel coerced, we need to kind of recognize that. And so rather than imposing change, notice what happens if I invite and include others in a co-creation process. And again, Peter Block, in his book, Community, the Structure of Belonging, what he does, which I appreciate, is lay out how do you know you have a community where there's a structure of belonging. And he suggests there are 6 kinds of conversations that happen. And I probably should have created a slide around this, but conversations is that people feel like they're invited. They're invited, though, with expectations. That people are talking about the possibilities, so that's number 2. Number 3, that there's a sense of ownership. So not only are they talking about the possibilities, they're talking about the data as if it's ours, not theirs. And then there's conversations about dissent. And I think dissent is the cousin of diversity, right? So that people are willing to have a real no than a fake yes in the conversation. And then from there, people are having conversations about what their commitments are. Commitments as a coalition, as alliances, as individuals, as pairs. But the final conversation is people are recognizing the gifts of being in community and the gifts of what it means to strive for well-being. And well-being, you've heard in some of the other places I've talked, where well-being to me, community well-being to me is the simultaneous and balanced satisfaction of personal, relational, and collective needs. Right? So it's not just enough to figure out how to work with the African-American boys in Oakland Unified. We know that if we can get it right with them, it will have implications for getting it right for other people. So we need to be okay that we're going to focus on those who need it most. So I think in Oakland anyway, especially with the local control funding formula, we're understanding and we're having conversations that equal does not always equal fair, right? So the idea that truly be equitable, we need to be okay that we're going to give greater resources to those in greater need. And there's a lot of need in Oakland, and there's a lot of need in all of our places, right? I mean, we have a surplus of suffering. And I know suffering happens, right? So there's, people pass away, people get sick, but we know that we've created more suffering than we need on our earth, in our world, things like oppression. There's people who don't need to be, in my belief, hungry, who don't need to be homeless, who don't need to be beat or beaten or beating, right? So there's a lot of those things that I think it lends to a surplus of suffering. So when I think about how social change happens, it gets back to the why, how, and what, right? Where for now, part of what I'm looking at when I'm talking about leadership development and social change, I think the why is that we need to do movements. So I'm working with organizations and leaders, or even educational leaders, where we need to say, why are we doing what we're doing, and is what we're doing aligned with somewhere else? And how is our work in education complementary to our work in the city around deep democracy? And how is that related to things in our county around the ACA, right? Affordable Care Act. How is that related to the safety issue? So we need to be able to look at things systemically. And how do we do that? We know that there are various types of organization. Again, it gets back to the question, the answer to how is yes. But we need to acknowledge that there are organizing and advocacy groups. There are intermediaries who are helping people do things better. And there are service groups. And a lot of my work now is helping the advocates talk with the service groups, because I work with health clinics who don't like some of the organizing that's happened to change around what's happening around policy and ACA. And then there are folks like health outreach partners who are training people on how to be good service providers, but they have funky or different ideas about what good policy is. And so unless we see the relationship between these types of organizations, how they really need to work with each other, and a book called Forces for Good talks a lot about that, how organizations, some of the best organizations, are those who actually have a little bit of service, advocacy, and intermediary elements within the organization. And if they don't have all three, that they're partnering with folks so that they're in communication. So the policy folks are in touch with the grassroots folks. So the grass tops are talking to the grassroots, right? And those who are developing both are understanding what the shared vision is. And for me, when I think of the types of change, there are types of change at the policy level. There are types of change at the systems level, so systems being things like education being a system, health being a system, housing being a system. And there are changes at the organization level, so like at the school level, at the district level, right? So once I understand that, and then I understand how the types of organizations have a different role in the types of change that need to happen. And so what is the social change that I think needs to happen? Kramer and Fania talk about collective impact in 2011, and they have lots of other articles that came out of that from the Stanford Social Innovation Review journal. And they suggest that getting to collective impact is working with different kinds of organizations who aren't all about education, working with housing, working with economic development, working with Parks and Rec, working with health, to be able to say, hey, can we have a shared vision or shared action for our local community? And can we talk about what are the metrics that we can use to be able to compare? One of the things I've noticed that's been horrible but getting better in Oakland, actually in our county, is that the county has a different way of collecting data than the school district, than the city. And so we really don't know how we're doing with any of our populations. But a few years ago, they've made a joint agreement to say, let's start sharing data. And what that required is that they had to come up with a shared system. And they're doing better getting there, but it's still some posturing and some hiding things from each other. And some of it is just because there isn't a lot of trust, right? So there has to be some trust. But common metrics is a big piece of that. The other thing that's happening in collective impact is mutually reinforcing activity. So for example, in a school community, to recognize how the school is partnering with the neighboring health clinic, is partnering with the neighboring youth development organization, is partnering with the police to be able to say, how are we working together? You do that, we'll do this, and you can do that, right? So know that we don't have to do the same thing, but is there a way to coordinate our activities so they're reinforcing each other towards the vision that we strive for? Continuous communication, again, just being able to meet regularly and talk about how's it going and be vulnerable with each other to share what's working, what's not. One of the things that I've been supporting people to do is have conversations about this thing that we call spectacular failures. Like, what have we really done that's made a mistake that we really want to be able to say, hey, how can we stop calling them mistakes and really start calling them learning opportunities? What are things that just aren't going right that we want to be able to build from rather than trying to hide some things from each other? So right now I'm creating a process called an innovation lab that's pulling from the design school out of Stanford around design thinking action. And we're inviting people to create a prototype for some significant changes in their organizations but we're going to say what's successful is that we've actually experimented with something. So not that whatever we prototype is successful, but whatever we prototype, we have some data about whether it works or not. So the success is that we have data and that we can draw some conclusions rather than feel like we have to have a good product. So we're banking on, we've been fortunate to get some funding from organizations who are willing to take risks with our risk-taking innovation lab. And so that's our role about being a backbone organization, where we're supporting that numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 with organizations who typically wouldn't talk with each other. And all this, again, is towards a greater community impact. So any questions or comments about that?
Kim just jumped in here with a question. I'm going to read it, and if I don't get it right, I'll let her say it for herself. Regarding the wraparound services community entities can provide to students' families that you were just describing, do you see the schools being leaders and not managers here, or would you expect they would be managers in this case? That's an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, so this is, so I just created, I had a program about a month ago, I guess, May 22nd, where I did a little theater of the oppressed activity, and if folks are familiar with that, it's sort of like you run a scene, and then you run it again and stop it, and then people can take the place of the players on the stage and that kind of thing. And the scene was where the school district said, hey, we just got $1.5 million from a grant, and really it's to have us collaborate with each other. So I'm going to tell you how we're going to collaborate, right? So that's problematic in all fronts. So all that to say that one of the things that often happens when organizations actually do have more power and more authority in a community is that they think whatever they're doing is helping people without even having a conversation about what it means to help people. So stepping back, deeply, I believe, and Paulo Freire says this, right, and a lot of people have talked about this, organizers I work with, Causa Justa Just Cause, active women, that say the leaders of social change have to be those folks who are most affected by the oppression. The school district is not the most affected by the oppression. It's the people, the kids and their families who are most affected. So there has to be a degree of scaffolding so that the organization, the district, can see how they must be humble with their passion. So they might be passionate and they may have a lot of authority, but they can't be the ones who have a lot of leadership, because what they're going to do is inadvertently, in my belief, coerce people to kind of work within their already dysfunctional system, because that's all they know. And that's how bureaucracies work, right? Bureaucracies aren't built to change. Bureaucracies are modeled after the machine. And so oftentimes what happens is they're trying to create more rules and policies within this machine. And so part of what I think the work is how do we create school districts and other governmental agencies to be prepared for what it means to truly be humble and what it really means to have conversations at deep democracy. And deep democracy is having a structure where we can explain, critique, and then mobilize towards transformative social change. So again, back to the question, what's the school district's role? I think the school district should always be there, but their role has to be often more around providing the resources that they have as support, as being able to do an educational thing. Right now, one of the platforms I'm running on is I think the school district has to teach the community, help the community learn how budgeting processes happen. And because otherwise, they're just going to keep doing budgets for the community rather than budgets with the community. And that's radical, right? So, and that's not everyone's going to be able to understand that. And I think most of the times leaders, I know Michelle and I have worked with leaders who their belief about why they were chosen to be leaders was to kind of push down their philosophy and their agenda onto the community rather than come into the community and listen to what the community wants and then mobilize that. So we have a new superintendent coming in Oakland, and he was chosen, I believe, because of his middle school and high school success, where he's able to turn middle schools and high schools around in Denver. And that's what we really need. My hope is that he's just not going to force down his agenda, but he's going to understand the context in which he's now leading and that he works with rather than, again, for, on behalf, and then consequently impose his change on the community.
Renato, I'm thinking about serving on school site council at my kids' elementary in Oakland, and we have black principal and a majority, white council, and of course the white parents were the minority in the school.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of my goals was to diversify the school site council, as the white chair.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to make my rounds and talk to parents, on the yard about why they would or would not come. Well, it's just basically white people's thing, and we don't want to participate. I said, well, yeah,
Right.
We'll continue to be that way unless you show up.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was this really well-grounded natural skepticism about whether parent input really did anything at all. And
Yeah.
that was very fair because, as you know, school site council's governing ability is very, very limited, and it really was a rubber stamp for the most part. So.
Yeah. And again, there's some funky rules that don't allow people to kind of study together, right? So
Yeah.
I used to pull some parents together, say, let's take a look at the plan before we go to the meeting. But if you have too many people sitting together talking about the work, there's this thing called the Brown Act. Again, I don't know if this is across the country, but in California, in Oakland, there's the Brown Act and Sunshine where you got to post anytime you're going to talk about something. If there's a majority of people on the public entity meeting. And so we couldn't study together because it wasn't posted, meaning that people should be able to show up and listen to how we're studying together. So we would get together unprepared.
Yeah.
And that's really a unfortunate, I think, unintended consequence of some of the things. Like, how do people learn and not feel embarrassed to kind of learn stuff in front of public? But we need to get to the point, again, that's where humility, I think, comes in. We need to get to the point where it's okay to say, I'm not sure, I don't know. So how do I learn it in front of others and not be judged for that and say, this is what part of the process is?
Mm-hmm. I had a thought as we get toward closure here were there other questions that came in from members of the group that you haven't got to or that seem sort of representative that you'd like to touch on before we close here?
Well, I think, again, I hope folks do take a look at it, but I think what I got, a couple things is this whole idea of what does it mean to kind of really incorporate love into the work? How do you define love? And I think, and I appreciate those questions, and how do you actually get to a point where people can actually tell stories with each other? And what I found, again, I don't think this is unique to our area, but everyone's got a story, right? And the work, in a lot of ways, is be able to change the narrative. And if we don't know each other's stories, there's no way we can change the narrative. So I think there has to be work where we're telling stories, and we tell the stories and study the context in which these stories are being created. So one of the things I put in there is a report, or I attached was a report on black male achievement called Building a Beloved Community, where they realized that in order to develop the capacity, we need to kind of tell different stories. We need to, one, change the narrative, but we need to get really concrete about how stories get out there. So it's like doing things like leveraging social media, increasing the evidence out there that says, how can we still have the story when this is what the evidence suggests, right? So how can we talk about all the bad things that the black boys are when we also have great examples of how the black boys are doing this or succeeding and excelling here? And again, getting back to thinking about social change and movements, we have to invest in holistic, preventative, and systemic solutions, not just isolated ones. So what I got from a guy by the name of John Powell, he talks about understanding there's a universalism to our healing. But to truly be transformative, we have to have some targeted universalism, right? So the idea that we do have to make some movement, but it has to be targeted, and it has to be systemic. And that's work, right? So that's being able to understand the whole system and not just little pieces of the system. So again, not just working on education and not thinking about workforce investment. not thinking about the environment, or not thinking about a safety are just all problematic things. They all have to be connected, and we have to recognize it, not to kind of just increase the complexity, acknowledge that it's complex, and it's my belief, though, we can still figure out how to talk about it simply, not in a simplified way, but simple way where we all can be engaged in acknowledging the complexity of it. And we do have to work with each other to invest in the organizational capacity. So again, I think it's important for folks to understand the distinction between leadership and management and how both is necessary. Both are necessary, right? So we don't just want people who are charismatic leaders, but they can't plan or organize and budget, right? I think it was Edison, and we always used to say this when we were together at Basis, where a vision without a plan is a hallucination, right? So being able to say, where are we heading? But if we don't have a good plan of how we're going to get there, again, it's what matters and the how together, then it's problematic.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I think we're Pau is they say in Hawaii, and Laura Hallberg wants a shout out to Vallejo, saying that's her hometown too. So,
oh, right on.
Just putting one more little California vote in there, and she works over there in Concord, so you two may want to run.
Oh,
into
yeah.
her.
Okay. Well, look me up. 510-520-1658 is my cell, and then you all got my email now, I think, right?
They will if they don't already.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're ready to close. Renato, this has been fabulous. Usually I would bring Pam back in and let her mop up, but I don't think she's speaking tonight. So, Matt, do you want to add anything before we close?
I just want to say thank you to Renato. I'm not remotely well-versed in this stuff like the students are, but this was really interesting for me to listen to, too. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and do I get a copy of this tape, or what,
Sure.
how this works?
Yeah, we're going to upload it to YouTube, and I can happily send you the link.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I'll include, when I post the video in Blackboard, I'll make sure to include your email address so folks can reach out to you if need be.
Yeah, please. Yeah, and truly, I'm the kind of person who, and Michelle knows that, I know my stuff isn't all great, right? So I know I'm just putting stuff out there in some ways to be provocative. So if you want to dig into it and say, dude, you kind of whacked or whatever, please go there and just know that we'll engage. And I know, and then I'll take it as a sign of affection that you're giving me that kind of feedback. So just to let you know. I mean, Michelle knows I love teasing. I'm the oldest of 4 in a Filipino family, and that's all I knew growing up. So I always thought that they loved me, right? So.
We do, Renato. We love you.
Yeah,
all right. Shout out to Oakland. Good to speak
right
to you tonight. Thanks for coming to meet us here on the East Coast.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
All right,
Renato.
All right, take care.
Bye. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.